excited to introduce a topic today that's certainly close to the heart of the graduate school and Analogy and Hargreaves' work with scholars and students at risk, and certainly at the Division of Global Affairs. We just launched our Center for Emerging Threats in the 21st Century, and one of our research groups is actually pursuing this idea of scholars and students at risk to better produce and understand and disseminate research on the subject. So today I'm really excited to introduce Sara Willcox and Nele Feldmann. Sara Willcox is the director of the Institute of International Education Scholar Rescue Fund. With over 15 years in higher education grants administration and nonprofit management, she oversees the IIE Scholar Rescue Fund operations, including partnerships, program policy, outreach, and communications. Ms. Willcox joined IIE SRF in 2003 after 3 years with IIE as an advisor to the international Fulbright students. She represents IIE and the Scholar Rescue Fund in various initiatives and partnerships, including the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, the Welfare of Scientists Working Group of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, and the European Union's Temporary Relocation Platform, and the newly formed University Alliance for Refugees and At-Risk Migrants. In addition to her experience in the U.S., Ms. Willcox has studied and worked in North and Southern Africa, Europe, and the Middle East.
Nele Feldmann is the program lead for the Platform for Education in Emergencies Response at the Institute of International Education. In this role, she manages the PEER platform, the Syria Consortium for Higher Education in Crisis, and the Emergency Student Fund. Nele holds a BA in Political Science and an MA in Translation for Arabic and French from the University of Bonn, Germany. She completed the prestigious Arabic program at the French Orient Institute in Damascus and spent extensive time studying and working in Syria. Prior to joining IIE, she served as a program manager at IIE and assistant program officer for the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange for Young Professionals. She has spent extensive time studying and working in Syria, Egypt, and France. Please welcome our two speakers for the day.
Let's see. I don't know, is this on? Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Well, it's really nice to be here today at Rutgers, and I think Sara and I, we've been here at least, I think Sara even more than I, but we've just been here a few weeks ago on February 2nd for the launch of the UARRM, the University Alliance for At-Risk Migrants and Refugees. Okay, so even I do forget that name all the time. So it's really nice to be here. I'm gonna talk about everything that IIE is doing related to students. And Sara's going to take over, and she's going to really give you all of the information regarding scholars. I'm just going to move on to that slide. So those are all of the IIE student emergency initiatives. I mean, I can be more professional and really pull it up as a slideshow, but you can see we didn't really prepare a lot of slides because I think the goal for today is that we want to have a discussion with all of you guys. We just want to let you know what we're doing and where we're coming from, but then hopefully we can, just respond to any questions you may have. So at IIE regarding students, our biggest initiative at the moment is the Platform for Education in Emergencies Response, PEER, the IIE Syria Consortium for Higher Education in Crisis, the IIE Scholarship Program for Syrian students, 100 Syrian women, 10,000 Syrian lives, from camps to campus, and the Emergency Student Fund. So just by having a look at that slide, you can see that in terms of our student engagement, we do a lot of programs with Syria. The IIE Syria Consortium was founded in 2012, and that was really kind of looking at the crisis happening in Syria, and then in a way acknowledging that there's no kind of first or emergency response specifically for students. So while IIE was helping a lot of students, especially through the ESF, the Emergency Student Fund before, in a way the consortium was our first formalized effort to help students from crisis areas. Due to the experience with the consortium, we felt, I think it's universities and organizations such as IIE, a lot of organizations started and universities started working with Syrians, acknowledging just like the dimensions of the crisis. But then at some point, I think we all realized while there's a higher number of displaced students from Syria compared to other countries, they're certainly not the only students who do face threats and emergencies, and they're certainly not the only students who really need the opportunity to continue their higher education. So just to make sure, obviously IAE, we recognize that there's a huge demand for primary and secondary education, but just due to the nature of IAE, what we do is higher education. So with PEER, with the Platform for Education Emergencies Response, that was only founded or launched, I would have to say, on March 1st, 2017. So we basically just had our first year anniversary. And again, we did focus very much on the needs of Syrian students for the first year. And why? Just because we have a strong network of universities and other partners who do work with Syrian students, but then at the same time recognizing that now year 2, we have to kind of, just in a way work on having a different scope of work, if that makes sense. So it's still going to be different to say, well, from now on we're just going to include opportunities for any displaced students from any part of the world. Well, that is what we would want to do. I guess like everyone in the room understands there's always resources and limited resources. So again, we will have to prioritize a little bit. But PEER, I like to call it an initiative, if you will, just because it doesn't necessarily have grantees. And when I say grantees, for the consortium and for the scholarship, obviously, we provide funding and then we place students at a university. So that is kind of what we would define as a grantee. With PEER, it really is a resource for universities, but also for students and organizations. I kind of like to call it a little bit of the stock market of scholarship opportunities. So where universities offer scholarships and students go to PEER to find scholarship opportunities. It's not limited to the United States. I think in a way, I always appreciate that the topic today is that we're going to talk about what can universities in the United States do to really help students and scholars displaced by crisis, but just to say that PEER is not necessarily limited to the United States, but it's really including opportunities for students from all over the world. And I think just to set the tone a little bit, you heard it from my bio, I have a special place in my heart for Syria. I did spend most of my time studying abroad in Syria. I did, as many, when people say, what was really the biggest impact of studying abroad, it was certainly what happens to many people. It's my husband, who is from Syria, and our kids were half Syrian, so I kind of even have to remind myself sometimes that also I shouldn't be so focused on Syria, but that there are really, again, so many other places where students face emergencies, and we want to make sure as an institution that we provide all the resources available to help them. That said, again, most of the experience on the student side is with Syria, and I think we have a video. It's one of our students who came to the United States and he studied social work, which was quite I think, for his family, not necessarily expected, because you might know that a lot of the students, they want to study medicine, a lot of the students want to study law or engineering, so to have someone from Syria who really went into social work, I think was a surprise for his family, but also a little bit for us. And he, after his bachelor's degree at Salve Regina, which is a small liberal arts college in Rhode Island, he now got a scholarship at Columbia University, and he's studying, or he is in their international studies program, and he has a focus on human rights. So I think he really, at the time of the interview, he was still a bachelor's student, but I do think that he is a great example of what one scholarship can really do, not only for the individual, but really it kind of trickles down to all of his family, all of his networks, and even his community. So I kind of just wanted to show that to you to set the tone a little bit in terms of what can really universities in the United States do.
I grew up in a small city called Masyaf in Syria. One day on my way to school, I was commuting from my city to the city where I studied, and then a bus exploded in front of me. And that's why, at that point, I was like, no more school. I started to look up for other options to continue my education. And I was very lucky eventually to get a scholarship from Salve Regina University in Rhode Island, and they offered me a full tuition scholarship. The university was very supportive to me, and I felt very treated specially, and I was very welcome. I studied social work, and from the beginning I wanted to focus on refugees and immigrants. in general. So I did an internship last year for an entire year working with refugees. So I was helping them even as simple as applying for social security card. They couldn't do grocery stores or take them just to buy clothes or buy food. For me, that was a great way to give back to this community, just by helping this vulnerable population. If someone, his house or their house was destroyed by shelling or a civil war, if someone had a bus exploded in front of them, they couldn't go to school, if someone lost their family that they supported, it's not their fault of not continuing their education. The experience that I'm having here is incredible, and I think any Syrian students who's going to have this same experience here is going to make huge and tremendous differences to the country, again, to bring it to life.
Okay, so that is Sinan. He is one of our Syrian students, and I think in a way he captures, what can universities do to help students pretty well. So what Sara Regina offered, again, it's a small liberal arts college, and a university like Rutgers has a lot of resources. And that is Spark. You can also look them up. They do great work, again, with a lot of displaced students. And it's like a bit hard to move, sorry. So I think Sinan, he kind of captures very well what universities can really do. A lot of times, specifically higher education is really considered a luxury. It's not necessarily on top of the list when it comes to any type of developmental aid or any type of emergency aid that is sent to countries. It is part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in a way, of course, I'm very biased for education, working at an institute like IIE, but sometimes I do feel that if we solve the challenge of education, a lot of the other goals, will be much easier reached. Because if you just think about gender equality, and basically, I could count on all the list of the Sustainable Development Goals. I feel if we can only solve education, that's going to be a huge step. And specifically, again, when it comes to higher education, it's not only that people need primary and secondary education. A lot of times we see that if they have a prospect of being able to continue into college, they're more likely to finish a secondary education. And at the same time, I think at IIE, we do look a lot at the training of teachers. So if you want to have teachers who are going to be able to then train the next generation to do primary and secondary education, you do need teachers who went through higher education to be able to go back and share what they learned with the next generation. So again, we very much advocate for higher education not being a luxury, but higher education really being part of the solution to education in emergencies. And I think that is a lot of times how we call the field we're working in at IIE. I'm sure that all of you know that this is the biggest movement of forcibly displaced people since the Second World War. And again, there are a lot of students and a lot of scholars, a lot of faculty among those people. And the Syria crisis, in our opinion, only brought that topic on the top of the agenda. So it was very much there and existent before, but just due to the number of students and the number of scholars that really, I think, actively demanded to get back into higher education, that is why organizations such as IIE or other organizations specifically in Europe or our partners in Canada very much started focusing on how can we help, what is our role in helping students get back to higher education. We have a history in supporting students, but I think as many universities, it was not necessarily part of our mission, right? I mean, no one has in our mission statement that serving displaced students is something that we should do. And a lot of times, I don't want to say a lot of times, but there are times when we talk to universities and they really say, well, but how can we help? But then if you really think about it, Sinan was talking about the scholarship opportunity that he got from Sara Regina University. And he is in New York, so we have a very close relationship with him. And it really changed not only his life, but the life of his whole family. So by providing one scholarship opportunity, I love what our colleague at Sara Regina says. It's a private university, so I do realize that the way they distribute funding is more flexible than public universities. But she says it really doesn't cost us anything extra to have one additional chair in the room, right? So it really doesn't cost us anything to have him there, provide an education. At the same time, the way she phrases this a lot of times, it's part of our internationalization mission. So he brings a lot of diversity to the classroom. He has a perspective that he can share with his classmates that really no one else has. And I think it's very important when we say, so what can universities do? Yes, we strongly advocate for every university to offer, let's say, one scholarship. We have more than 4,000 higher education institutions in the United States. So if really, that's what our president always says, right? So if really only, if every university would offer one slot, then we would have 4,000 students. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, we have about 200 students that we help come to the United States through our programs. And as you might imagine, it certainly did not get easier over the last year and a half, let's put it like that. It was never necessarily easy, but we're certainly in an environment that makes it more challenging. But at the same time, we do have a lot of universities who step up and say, well, we would like to work with displaced students. Specifically, when it comes to universities and what they can do, we have universities who feel it's getting more and more challenging to get Syrian students from outside who are still either in Syria or in Turkey or in another country to the US. Then I do encourage universities to kind of also look at, who is in your community. We have a few resettlement centers in the United States. There's always a way to kind of reach out to the community and see, are they actually resettled refugees that a university can work with? A lot of times what we see is they face the same challenges as someone who is coming directly from, let's say, Afghanistan. So usually the challenges are funding. That is very much on top of the list. If they're not only already in the United States, then it's really the visa. So it's funding and the visa. Is anyone aware of a group called Books Not Bombs?
Yeah.
Yes. So would you want to say what they do?
I'm aware of them, but not. I don't have a very in-depth knowledge of them.
So what they want to do is they formed, and they kind of, in a way, lobby their university administrations to provide scholarships, again, in the beginning specifically for Syrians, but I think they also moved into more refugee populations. I think when we say refugees, or when they say refugees, it's a little bit wishy-washy, to be honest. It can be someone who comes here on an F1, but they do come from a country where, they suffered from a civil war or conflict, or it might actually be someone who came here resettled by UNHCR. But just to say, what they want to do is they want to encourage their universities to offer those scholarships for, let's say, vulnerable student populations. And I think an example, what we always say, what is working really well in Canada, what can universities do? They can work together with their student body, where students pay, let's say, $5 per semester, and that goes into a fund, and that fund actually funds displaced students who come on their campus. So it's kind of like a little bit of a matchmaking, where whatever the students basically contribute to the fund, the university matches, and by that they're able to provide those scholarships to displaced student populations. In terms of higher education, when I have a very good friend, he is Palestinian, I guess, by passport, although he grew up in Syria. And he was displaced in Lebanon for a very long time before he managed to go to Sweden. He managed to finish his bachelor's degree, and then he got a scholarship for Oxford University. I think when we talk about displaced students and refugee students, it is very important for them to get the feeling that they deserve a scholarship. So let's say you create a scholarship at Rutgers University, right? And for example, some of the students might contribute to a fund that then helps the student to really be able to come here, live here, and finance their education. Part of the narrative is really that we want to make sure that they kind of own their own agenda, that it's not us owning their agenda. You want to make sure if you have a scholarship, it really empowers students to, in a way, lead a very self-determined and independent life. I think a lot of the students coming from a displaced context, they want to make sure that they're not only seen as victims, as someone who really needs help, but they really want to make sure that if they get an opportunity, we have extremely positive experiences with all of our students. We almost never have a student who quits a scholarship. We almost never have a student who is, I don't even want to say like not successful academically. They usually really thrive and they appreciate the opportunity. And then you kind of set them up to have this, to really them into really being someone who takes ownership of their future, but also of the future of their community. And they usually help their siblings and their families, and they are a role model for the broader community. So I think in terms of helping those students, we also want to make sure that we tell their story, and we also look at what can they really do for the university, if that makes sense. I have some statistics because I know that usually people like to have a look at the statistics. So those are only statistics for peer. Again, it is a website, it is a database. Can you guys see that? Kind of? Yeah. So again, it is a database and it allows us to collect a lot of information on who is really using that database. Again, keep in mind that for the first year, you can see it was March 1st, 2017 when we launched until March 22nd, 2018. So that is basically the first year where we still focused very heavily on Syria, but also thinking about, again, we're talking about displaced student populations. So I think in terms of countries, I will say that Syria and United States, they kind of like switch position a little bit, but it does make sense. We do have a very strong presence here in the United States, so a lot of the universities and also students already here know about us, so they kind of know about peer first. But we're very happy to see we have Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Germany, all very big host countries of specifically Syrian student populations. Top cities, the same picture. Not set means people use proxy, so we can't really find where the biggest group is coming from. We have Damascus, Istanbul, New York. It's not us. We took our office out of any kind of statistical counting, I guess, and Beirut. We're very happy to see that 53% of those who use the website are female. Just a comment on that, you saw that we are co-administering the 100 Syrian Women program. Again, it is a somewhat very sad statistics that prior to the war in Syria, you had almost 50-50 female-male at universities. That picture changed completely. And I think, Sara, correct me if I'm wrong, one of our colleagues, they did research in Turkey, and that research, and you know, it can only be as accurate as it can be, but it was only 3% of the women who are displaced continue into higher education. So again, there should be also at universities who want to work with that specific population, they should have a look at, of course, there's academic merit, but also maybe making sure that they have an equal representation of students in terms of gender. Age, I think, is very interesting, just because usually when we say university age, we talk about 18 to 24. But specifically in this context, and I'm pretty sure that that's not only the case for Syria, if you think about education being disrupted and interrupted and people being displaced, it will need some time for them to get back into education. We have seen a few scholarships where it said, well, you have to be between 18 and 24. As you can see, 25 to 34, that is the biggest group of users for the peer website. Why? They do need some time to kind of get settled in the new host country, and then in a way almost find the time to refocus on what really they want to do with their lives. And a lot of them do want to go back into higher education, but just to make sure that also when thinking about students and thinking about the specific population, it again goes up to 35, that is what we see a little bit, and we think, I don't have evidence for that, that the 35 to 44 and up to 54, the website is not only for students, it's also for university administrators and organizations, so of course we do have people who might not only search for scholarship opportunities. But I think it is important to keep in mind that many of the students we're talking about are slightly older, and also keeping in mind that some of them, and I think it's specifically true for the scholars, they bring families. So it's not even only about saying, okay, I have this one scholarship for one student, but really when the UNHCR has a very nice document that says what are the kind of the minimum requirements for university universities if they want to set up a scholarship program. And I think that's a great document. I'm happy to share the link so you can maybe share it with everyone. But it really just poses a few questions. That there are a lot of lessons learned at IAE, a lot of things we didn't really think about when we drafted our first scholarship program. So I think it's not only about, we have the funding, we have, let's say, a college or a school within your university that participates, but it's a lot of, sometimes we say that the devil really lies in the detail, and that's not even talking about the visas, but it's also a lot about what happens when the student is here, what happens when they're on campus. A lot of them come from just like a very different educational system, a very different educational background. A lot of the contacts we work with are the international student offices, to be very honest. Why? Because they know what the needs of international students. And usually we always have one strong advocate in the international office, but what you also need is a very strong advocate in the admissions office. So if a university thinks about joining, let's say we have an SIO, that's how we call it, a senior international officer, who says, I want to make this happen. But then they really need to get their admissions office on board. And they really need to get the whole university leadership on board. First for funding, but then also imagine those students, the challenges in terms of applying, and there are a lot of challenges, and I don't have the time to talk about all of them. It really starts with the application. Some of them do not have access to the internet 24/7. It starts with paying the application fee. A lot of them don't have a credit card, so they really can't just go online, pay the fee, and start their application. It goes to letters of reference if they're displaced, and a lot of the universities are not in touch anymore with their professors. So all of these things are really challenges, and before even launching a program, you need to make sure that you have different departments on board, and that those different departments are aware of the challenges that most of these students face. It might not be the same for, let's say, a Syrian student and an Afghani student, but in general, we do see a pattern, if I can call it like this, of challenges that most of the students face. Lack of documentation. Most students have some documentation. It's, I think, very rare that there's a student who doesn't have any documentation at all. But really, does it have to be an original? Because sometimes that is really hard to get by, right? So again, admissions is very, very critical when it comes to working with those students. And it's very critical to have, there should be support from the student body, but at some point you need the support of the university leadership to really make it a more sustainable effort. And I think it can be a very sustainable effort if you, for example, say, well, we want to have one scholarship for a refugee/displaced student. It doesn't have to be necessarily, Syria or like a specific country, but then in terms of how that is administered, those are all things that need to be determined before even launching. Because again, what we have learned a little bit the painful way, you want to be very careful in terms of raising expectations for those students. So you don't want those students to be like all excited and kind of give them the idea they're almost admitted, but then there are like some internal struggles and it might fall through. Because again, keep in mind they're sitting there waiting for, let's say, a year, 2, 3. So they're like anyway in a very in a position where they feel so much of what they're doing is in the hands of others, right? So I think once a university has a scholarship, they want to be very mindful of how they communicate with students, how they basically, I mean, you will always have more, you want more than one application, but you want to make sure that students understand it's a, let's say, competitive process. You want to be mindful of, what they might already think of, okay, I'm going to come to Newark, I'm going to be at Rutgers, and this is what I'm going to do. So we always want to be very careful in terms of managing expectations. We also want to be very careful in terms of being very upfront with them. You might get a scholarship, but there still is the whole living expenses challenge. And I mean, I'm sure some of you have that challenge not coming from a displaced background, right? So it's really not only about like, well, we have a scholarship, we had those situations. We have the emergency student fund. We bring students here, we place them at a university where they get a full scholarship. A year in, the university is calling us, it's like, well, our students are out of money, what are we going to do? And then we're like, well, IAE currently doesn't have a whole lot of, we are a nonprofit, we need to raise funding to be able to give it out to students. So again, also keep in mind that living expenses is one of the biggest challenges for students. And in terms of the visa, they only have to prove for the F1 that they have financial means for the first year. But then a lot of those students are kind of, we call it at risk of dropping out, just because again, they don't have the funding available. And that is one of the, we almost think about it like a worst case scenario, where you get a student here, and you didn't really think it all the way through, and we think it is our responsibility, if we facilitate a placement, that we make sure that the student has appropriate funding for the full duration of their studies, and not only for tuition or not only for the first year. If you work with those students, and that is kind of, I think, the same case if you're a student who kind of likes to connect with that specific student population, or if you're faculty, social media is the way to go. This is actually went down to the first month. Most of our students find out about IIE, the scholarships, peer, anything we do about on social media, and it's mainly Facebook. It's not necessarily Twitter so much, it's mainly Facebook. They use a lot of WhatsApp. So specifically when you want to get engaged with students, it's about kind of, I guess, how everyone is saying, you need to meet them where they are, and they are definitely on social media. Again, it's not so much Twitter. Specifically, we found that for students from the Middle East, it very much is WhatsApp and Facebook. So those are really the channels we use to reach out to students that might be interested in peer, or might benefit from peer, that might benefit from our scholarship opportunities. I don't want to talk really too much about all of the different programs in detail. I kind of want to just give it over to Sara to provide an overview of the scholars. I think some of the questions that we discuss on a very regular basis, and some of the questions that I would like to discuss with you, is really how to, or what universities reach out to us for, is how to navigate the challenges, right? So we are all aware of the challenges now. What do we do? What are the best practices? And again, the top challenges are really funding, meaning scholarships for tuition, but also the additional funding for living expenses. It is in the United States, and we're talking about the United States, a lot of the how do we navigate the political climate, and how do we navigate that specifically when we talk to students and want to encourage them to, yes, this is what's happening, but we still think this is a great placement for you. We still think the United States is a really great place for you to study. So we also get a lot of questions regarding, how do you at IIE in a way communicate the political challenges in the United States. Again, funding on all levels, but also what type of support do students need once they're on campus, and what type of support do they need when they apply. Again, the application process is a lot more difficult for those students than for any other regular international student, or of course domestic students. And what we also didn't think about necessarily when we launched the IIE consortium is what happens after they graduate. And that is a big, big question. We all assume that, well, we launched in 2012, the Syria conflict was kind of 1 year, how long can it take really? And we always, I think with all our programs, the idea is they come and they go back and they really, in a way, share what they learned in Syria with their home communities. But that, of course, didn't happen. A lot of students, we don't really give any guidance on status, right? So you should apply for asylum, or there's the temporary protected status. That is really not what IIE is doing. But then again, I said we have a responsibility to make sure that they come here and have the funding for the full duration of their studies. But we also kind of have a responsibility to at least let them know what are your options when you graduate and you cannot go back to your home country. And it might not even be you cannot, in all honesty, some might not want to go back to the home country for a variety of reasons. And again, I think where we were coming from, it was very much focused on the actual duration of studies. And now we're all moving into a phase where we feel okay, that is very important, and it's still going to be, at least on the student side, the primary focus. But again, we want to make sure that we have resources available to guide students into, if you don't want to go to grad school, which a lot of them do just because they feel that that's our only choice to be able to remain in the United States on a legal status. And that's always an option, that's great. I'm not saying that they shouldn't go to grad school, but some of them might choose or might have chosen a slightly different path where they first gain some work experience. So we are in the process of also getting together more resources in terms of, well, you're done with your education, you cannot go back to your home country. Those are some of the steps that you can take. Those are some of the options you do have. Because again, working with this specific population, one of our priorities is always to make sure that they have access to all the resources that can help them, and keep in mind that you don't want to put them in a situation, excuse me, that you don't want to put them in a situation where really they don't have, or they don't know what to do next. Because again, we, in a way, if I can put it like that, we got them here, so we want to make sure that they, that really we kind of help them all the way to, when I say, you know, they're independent, to really be able to lead that independent life, where then at some point they will not need the support of the university anymore, or IAE anymore, or any other organization. But for a lot of them to be able to do that, to be able to leave their home or host country, and to be able to kind of get to a place where they really feel empowered to you know, take ownership of their own lives and decisions, we see that university is a very crucial part. And if you ask a lot of the parents or students who are displaced, what really their #1 priority is, a lot of times even before, you know, kind of medical assistance or just like their necessities as food, they do name education. And I think the reason for that is really that education offers a pathway and the hope that at some point you will be able to lead a better life, and also not only for yourself, but also for your family, and kind of, you know, hopefully at some point for your kids. So really education, while in a way not always on top of the agenda, and not always on top of what people talk about when you, for example, go to the United Nations, it really should be very much on top, because it really does empower people, and universities are at the center of that. And then I'm going to give it to Sara.
I actually have some discussion of politics. I have some propaganda, some handouts if anyone wants to see them. This is just an overview of our program. If you'd like to pass them around, you don't need to take one, but if you'd like one. And this is just some highlights of our last year. So like Nele, I will not be relying on slides, but I will just put this up while I'm speaking so you can see some of the statistics. But first I'd like to say thank you for having us here. It's really just a pleasure to be surrounded by some new friends I've met over the last 6 months or so, and to meet some new colleagues here at Rutgers. Rutgers has been an incredible partner for the Scholar Rescue Fund. You may not know, but actually 2 of the scholars from the Scholar Rescue Fund through our fellowship are being hosted by the university as we speak. And Rutgers has actually hosted 5 scholars over the years. And interestingly, from Iran, Iraq, Ethiopia, Syria, and Turkey. And we can get to the issues facing many of the scholars from Turkey and Syria, which are the 2 major crises we're facing right now in terms of helping scholars around the world. I'll give you some background on the program just to sort of frame our context, and the world that now the Scholar Rescue Fund is operating in has changed drastically since I started working with the program. Scholar Rescue Fund was founded in 2002, and at the time it was founded, it was actually reflecting on IAE's long history. IAE as an institution has actually been around since 1919. So we're approaching 100 years. And in that time, sadly, IAE has responded to crises around the world, starting with the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of Nazism and fascism, the Spanish Civil War, World War II, obviously, the Hungarian uprising, onwards into apartheid South Africa, response to various crises in Asia. So there's a long history of supporting students and scholars by IAE in particular, but there was never a concerted effort until these efforts that Nele has described and the Scholar Rescue Fund were founded. They were really just responses to a particular crisis at one time in history. And our founders, actually trustees of our institute, among them were two key players in all of this who were refugees from Germany in the 30s and fled to the United States and were educated here, became quite successful in their own right, both academically and in the business world. And they were reflecting on IAE's history and thought, well, we've done things throughout history, why are we not responding consistently? We're waiting for a crisis to happen and then it's sort of a band-aid on the problem. So in establishing the Scholar Rescue Fund, it really was thinking through how are we helping scholars around the world? Surely they're not being affected in one country at one time. So in 2002, the program, basically, we help any academic and established scholar, so someone who can actively participate in the teaching and research at an academic institution around the world. So that's the sort of wider definition of a scholar. And then the second element is that the person is threatened or facing persecution in their home country. And really the idea of the program at its founding was to be an immediate response to scholars who needed immediate assistance, to respond to those who are needing to get out immediately, really needed a place of respite, with the hope that they would be going home shortly after the fellowship. So interestingly, when the program was founded, we actually only had fellowships for a one-year period, and very quickly did we realize that 1 year was certainly not enough to help scholars reestablish themselves, get their careers back on track, and then think about going home. So we now work on a model of, it's still probably in many arguments not enough, but we now can support scholars for 2 years. And to give you a sense of what we do, so it's called the Scholar Rescue Fund. In ways it sounds a bit dramatic to say that we're sort of running into countries and rescuing people. But in essence, we're relying very much on the scholars themselves to know about our program, whether through networks, human rights organizations, universities as well. Many academic colleagues in the US and around the world know of colleagues in their home countries who need help. So they are often telling their colleagues around the world about the program, and if they could qualify, they can apply directly to us. So we hear directly from the scholars, and there's an extensive vetting process. So a scholar will apply, where there's a basic info sheet, but from there, it's really an extensive conversation over email, typically, with the applicant to find out, is this person a scholar by our definition, and is this person threatened? And so answering those two questions is very complex. It draws on a lot of personal experiences. You're relying on someone's trust of us, and I often describe the Scholar Rescue Fund as a leap of faith. That it's a leap of faith on our part to support someone we've never really met. We're vetting them sort of electronically, so to speak. But then it's certainly a leap of faith on the scholar's part to respond to these very deeply personal questions that we're asking them by email, asking about what threats they've faced, what are they suffering now, and then of course how could we be the response, are we the right organization to help them? And often we're not. Often it's really a human rights group that needs to help them, or maybe it's a journalism program that needs to help them, or some other sort of larger global entity. But for those who do, so to speak, qualify, there's this extensive vetting process, and the team that I work with have become really experts in areas such as Syria, Turkey, Yemen now, unfortunately, but globally. We've been helping scholars from around the world. So far, we've helped 749 scholars directly with fellowships from 58 countries. So you can feel the sense of a really global concern for scholars around the world. And these scholars are facing everything from targeted threats for the work that they've done in their classrooms, so particular topic that they've taught. We've worked with Iraqis who were teaching Shakespeare and were threatened for that. We've supported scholars who've been threatened for their gender, their religious beliefs or identity, ethnic identity, any number of human rights abuses. And then, of course, we're helping scholars who are directly impacted by conflict, and that's where Syria, of course, comes in, Yemen increasingly, unfortunately. And now Turkey is a completely different dynamic. Scholars in Turkey have been distinctly and categorically and in wide numbers being impacted by a political fallout to their theories to all of this, but it goes back many years before the attempted coup in Turkey in 2016. But scholars in the thousands have been dismissed from their positions. They've lost their travel documents, their passports have been canceled. They've lost their ability to work in their country in any sector. So many of the Turkish scholars we work with have described a sort of civil death because they can't be academics, but they can't actually work in any field. So it's a very, very effective way of silencing very vocal population. And that's what we found through the years of Scholar Rescue Fund, that really to silence the scholars, our president, Alan Goodman, often says, you really silence, if you silence one scholar, you are silencing thousands around them, because you think of the position that scholars hold, that your professors hold in the community, in the university, on a global level, on a platform of just discussion on very important topics. If you silence that one voice, you are really silencing so many elements of free society. So in that, we are trying to be part of that response. And so for the past 15 years or so, we've been helping scholars by, once they've been selected by our selection committee, we then award them, so to speak, a fellowship of up to $25,000. And the model of that is to engage the university directly in supporting a scholar to bring that person to the university, wherever in the world they can go. So this is not just a US-based effort. We place scholars around the world in universities now, 381 universities have worked with us in 43 countries, including many of the countries that have now, Syria has hosted many of our scholars long before, and actually shortly before the crisis hit in their country. So the model is that the university hosting the scholar, and we reach out to our network of universities, including Rutgers, to say we have a scholar in X field, or we have 15 scholars from X countries. Would you be interested, or is there a place for that person in your academy? And then we work with different levels of the university administration. Sometimes it's an individual champion within a department. It could be a provost's office or the president. So it depends on how we sort of have a relationship with each institution. And from there we engage on helping these scholars individually. So would this person be a good fit for the chemistry department? Would this person be a good fit for the, any particular multi-department sort of cohort? So I think DGA here would actually be a prime, perfect place to host a scholar, and we've talked about that briefly beforehand. This is my, my propaganda here. So effectively, the university is really the important part, like the essential partner in the work that we do, because we're pairing a scholar where these scholars can continue the work that they couldn't do in their home countries. So return them to active work. Their voices are no longer silenced, they have a platform, or they can do their silent work. I often call them the silent pioneers. They don't have to be the Einsteins, they don't have to be at a platform, but they could quietly get on with the work that they could not do safely in their home country. And in the meantime, thinking of their next steps. So this is the key of the program. While we're placing scholars, and I should point out that the university not only is providing the academic space, but they're also essentially providing matching financial support. So the $25,000 that we provide from the fellowship, we also provide relocation funds and health insurance, and there are additional sort of funding elements to our program. But the university is actually providing a crucial matching grant to our grant. So it's a combined matched fund to support the scholar. It's for 1 year, and it can be renewed for a second year. Most of the scholars we work with are, in fact, taking up a second year. So while they're on their fellowship year, they're interacting as any visiting faculty would. They're working with students. They may be teaching, co-teaching. They may just be auditing courses while they're doing their own research. All the while, many of them are thinking, I have to return home, I have to return home. And many of them, of course, are not able to do that, coming from Syria, from Yemen, even now Turkey. And I could list any number of countries where scholars are not able to go back. Still, the program really, the purpose of the program is to be that immediate response. So to find them an academic position, allow these scholars to find the networks academically, to become part of the community. And then there's a very difficult time when scholars think, well, I'm here now, I have to focus on my work, I've just fled trauma and conflict and persecution. I have a family with me. I'm perhaps teaching in a completely new language. I perhaps don't even have the full language to teach in or to even write in this new environment. So language barriers, trauma, psychosocial issues, just the general acclimation to any place. I mean, if I move from New York to, say, Houston, Texas, I'm picking a random place, it could, the cultural adjustment there is extraordinary. Now consider a scholar from Syria or Turkey or from Ethiopia as an example. So there are huge adjustment issues going on for scholars, and while we are trying to support them through that, we're also trying to think for them and with them how they can find their next steps beyond the fellowship. So after 2 years, where are these scholars going? And in response to crisis in this topic of how universities respond to conflict and displacement, we had one sort of prime model that was, to us, was going to be the shining model of what we do. It was Iraq. And no one wants to think that Iraq is a shining model of anything in terms of conflict, but with us, we had created an Iraq Scholar Rescue project within the wider Scholar Rescue Fund effort. And that was really in response to the hundreds of applications we got over a sort of 6-month period from Iraqis shortly after the US-led invasion. And the sectarian violence was really destroying universities, destroying scholars' lives, affecting the whole country. So in 2006, we actually established the Iraq Scholar Rescue Project, which focused very specific funding on Iraqis. And through that project, we were able to bring scholars and try as much as we could to focus on finding them academic positions in the region. And that's where Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon brought in hundreds of scholars. In fact, Jordan is now, you can see here, is the #2 hosting country, even in 2017. And I should say these are 2017 numbers, these are not since inception. Jordan has been just sort of a light for so many scholars, hosting over 100 of our scholars over the years. And I'm bringing that to a point because the Iraq crisis taught us many things. One was we were often criticized for brain drain, that hundreds of our scholars were coming through the program and draining the Iraqi universities of their top scholars. True, but our response was if we'd not helped them, what would have been the result? So you can weigh brain drain or brain death, and we were sort of faced with a critical number of scholars who needed help. And in that response to brain drain was, while scholars are in their host countries, I should say, keeping them as close to the region where they're from was critical. And for the Iraqis, it was quite, in a sense, it was much easier because we had good contacts in Jordan. Jordan was very much interested in bringing these top academics from Iraq to the universities. So with that, we developed a distance learning project, and it goes on today, and we're trying to expand it into other countries. The distance learning project was really, at the time when Iraq didn't have the bandwidth to do live streaming of lectures into the country, we actually were very old school, recording scholars who were on their fellowships in Jordan and other parts of mostly in Jordan, Lebanon. We were recording their academic lectures and then putting them on a DVD and physically shipping them back to Iraq, where they were played in the universities to supplement gaps in the curriculum since they'd left the country. So it was a way of sort of bringing back their scholarship even though they physically couldn't be there. We've since advanced that now that the bandwidth has increased in Iraq. We're now still working with Iraqi scholars who are filming their lectures in Jordan, and they're now actually doing it live stream, so it's happening live. And now we're hoping to expand it to help scholars do full coursework. So it's not just one lecture at a time, but really developing a curriculum where they're pairing up with Iraqis in the country and Iraqis outside of the country to come up with a full coursework for the Iraqi students. Because now, since ISIS, Iraq is still very much rebuilding their universities. So we're hopeful that the scholars we worked with can be a part of that. And I bring it back to the Iraq project because that project has officially ended. Now Iraq is sort of part of the wider Scholar Rescue Fund effort. But in 2014, we had this great hope that this, the Scholar Rescue Fund model was really working because after 2 or 3 years, scholars were able to think about returning home. And by 2014, about 45–50% of the Iraqis we were working with either had gone back and retained really high-ranking academic positions, deanships, a couple presidencies in universities, or they had plans to go back. And then June of 2014, ISIS took over, and many of the scholars we were sort of rejoicing in their return were writing to us again saying we need help, we need to get out now. So it was a real, it just brought to our attention that one moment you can think there's this incredible hope of return, and then the next minute these scholars find themselves threatened again. So the response to that was, we keep responding to scholars on an individual basis. And Nele was referencing the numbers of refugees around the world. We're numbers that are hard to even fathom, but I think the more and more we read them in the papers, 65+ million forcibly displaced people, over 22 million refugees around the world. I think those numbers sort of wash over us now. We just read them and it's sort of like another number in a headline. And what I'd like to emphasize is the university's role in the individual person-to-person response. Because as you're taking in a student, as you're taking in a scholar, it may seem like a drop in the bucket compared to the millions of people displaced and affected. But as Nele was saying, you're helping a family, you're helping a community, and that ripple effect really is crucial. Not only to what the students and scholars are bringing to the university. I should say that these scholars are not, yes, they may be victims of conflict and various, terrible degrees of of suffering. But they're bringing with them incredible expertise and experience from their home countries, and that's infusing into their host universities. So I think it's really key to think about you're bringing in an asset, effectively an academic asset, into your academic communities. And by bringing that person in, it's that ripple effect. So in a way, if you're silencing one scholar, you're silencing thousands around them, but if you're giving voice back to that person, that student or that scholar, the ripple effect is endless. What I would like to say is, and it's again a point to this brain drain question, because we often do get it, we find that even though it's the scholar's last resort to leave their home country, no scholar I've ever spoken with has said, I was looking to leave. It was always their last resort, and they're never looking to stay as an asylee, or they all are looking to go back. Their last resort, maybe once they've arrived in the US or somewhere else, is to apply for asylum, and that's not a choice, it's really a sort of forced, it's a forced choice. But in that displacement, in hopes that these programs that are proliferating around the world, so Scholar Rescue Fund is not just one program, there are many, many now that are developing around the world, and I'll touch on that in a minute. In the displacement, I think scholars now have, as I said, their voice has been preserved, and we've found that so many of the scholars who've taken on the fellowship have been able to publish pieces that they could never publish in their home countries. They've been able to counsel students and advise students from afar. The Iraqi students we were working with were advising their master's students by text message, and they continue to do that. So the commitment to their students and fellow academics back home continues very much, and almost recharged in a way. Many of them are sending back academic resources that they couldn't get in their home countries. Again, this distance lecture idea, many of the MOOCs and things that are developing have been a huge boon to the scholars and students left in their home countries. So I think technology is certainly a part of all of this. But I think, again, with these headlines and the technology that we always hear about, it is really the individual person-to-person, one-on-one interactions that are essential. It can't be, we're going to do some distance learning and we're hoping to reach 1,000 students. It has to be that universities bring in these students and scholars and really make them part of the community. And I have to really acknowledge what Rutgers is doing, because I recognize that so many of the student population as well are coming from so many diverse areas. I think it's one of the most diverse campuses in the country, and many, I'm sure, are refugees who are being forcibly displaced. That voice is so essential, especially now in our political climate. And I'd like to say, though, that the silver lining to all this is that it's bringing such recognition and attention to it, such that even though perhaps a Syrian student or a Syrian scholar couldn't come to the United States, there are now, tens and tens of programs that are popping up, I feel like almost overnight, particularly in Europe, but around the world, to respond to students who are displaced or forcibly, taken from their higher education track. So one thing I'd like to say is that the Scholar Rescue Fund is very much engaging with other programs to develop different models. We are one model. We're certainly not the fix to any scholars' situations, but we are working with there are some local responses, there's some global responses as well. We consider ourselves global because we're responding to scholars from around the world. We place scholars in countries all around the world. But there are some very interesting models where it's one university in one particular location that's taking in, say, 2 or 3 students, and it's their own program. And so we're helping them think through those elements. There are programs throughout Germany that are building up, again, overnight it seems. And that, I think, has been very much a response to the political climate here. Certainly it's a response to the numbers of refugees that they're absorbing, but it's also to say, shame on you, some parts of the world, for not stepping up. We will step up, and I think that's a huge silver lining in all of this. So just to give you a general sense of where this work is headed, you may wonder what are the numbers of how many students or how many scholars are we helping every year, and it's a question we often ask ourselves, should we be helping more? And are we reaching everyone who needs help? And how do you find those people? When we've been flooded by applications from Turkey, from Syria, and now from Yemen, it almost seems that we don't need to do outreach. But it's important that these conversations that we're having today, and it's becoming a monologue, so I hope to change that into a conversation, but that these are conversations we're having with you all who can then spread the word in an organic way. Because the numbers are in that red box there, they indicate that the numbers are getting worse, that this is, we are in a time of crisis for sure. And we can't just do it through one organization, one university at a time. It certainly is important to have that individual response, but it's important as well to spread the word, I think, as much as possible. And I'm very proud to be part of this new University Alliance that Nele and others referenced, which has been spearheaded in large part by Rutgers, and Jane here has been a huge part of that. And there's a global coalition to protect education from attack, and I should mention that because it's a coalition of UN agencies, human rights groups, NGOs around the world that have said that there needs to be more advocacy and thoughts behind responding to educational institutions at all levels, primary through tertiary, to educational institutions that are being attacked through military campaigns or through conflict. So that coalition, I would recommend that you look into. It's called GCPEA, G-C-P-E-A. And again, it's just a growing response and attention brought to the issues that I think 5 years ago really, and hopefully we'll be leading it soon. But I do encourage you to keep pushing, ask the questions, the difficult questions, bring it to places where you wouldn't think these conversations should be happening, because I think you'll find yourself surprised. So I'll leave it at that. I'll just leave these statistics here, but I do want to emphasize that we try to de-emphasize the statistics because it really needs to be about the individual scholar, the individual student, one person at a time. And I think that makes it a little bit less daunting when you're trying to think, how can I respond to these crises around the world? So thank you again for having us, and I guess we'll open it up to questions. Should we start together? I don't know. For Nele or? Oh, just start here?
Yeah, Mike, thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
And work. First of all, I'm from Turkey, so I know a lot of stories. I personally try to help 8 people. At least half of them had more fundamental problems that they need some kind of visa or passport related assistance, because what happens is government confiscates their passport or cancel. If they go through UNHCR to take a travel document, the process is so lengthy because most of the time they are grave crisis places. There's a lot for it. And they even lose the position because of that, so it becomes too lengthy. They find other things. Do you have any assistance or any agreement to accelerate that process specifically for scholars and those kind of people?
Yeah, it's a burning question for us as well, and I'm afraid we haven't come up with a solution. So often the scholars themselves have been the sort of negotiator in what they can and can't do. And though we don't directly assist them in doing this, we found that many of the scholars from Turkey have done what many others have done, which is get to Greece somehow by boat, risk everything, risk being stopped because they don't have valid travel documents. And we have quite a number of scholars who've been through that, and then by getting to Greece or somewhere else, they've been able to get to Germany or other places. It's an incredibly, we have the same issue with scholars from Syria as well, without the documentation that they need. Often it's really relying on their knowledge of the networks on the ground. Scholars have asked, could they perhaps get to Georgia, the country, because there's no needed visa there. We've had a few scholars who've been able to get there, but then once there, what are their next steps? And we actually have a scholar right now in Georgia who cannot get out of Georgia to take up a position that we've lined up because his travel documents have been expired. And his wife's as well, she had to flee Turkey to join him, and in doing so, she left and entered Georgia illegally, so to speak. So it's a huge issue, and I wish we could offer advice. And in fact, just walking here today, I got an email from a scholar in Turkey who I met at a conference in France, actually. And at the time, she wasn't under threat. She felt she could speak openly about the issues. And she just wrote to me today to say that she's been dismissed and there was no reason given. And it's just a matter of time until her passport is expired, so, or rather, what's the word, invalidated. So our advice to scholars in those situations where they have found themselves dismissed suddenly is to, as quickly as possible before their passports have been invalidated, is to get out as soon as possible. Of course, there's so many dimensions to that. They have family, they have, so it's not as if they can just pack up and leave the next day, though many of them have done that. And I'm sure you know many more cases where scholars had to flee sort of under the cover of night. And those are the stories we've heard. And sadly, for those whose passports have been canceled, it's a mystery as to what, and it's a very effective, and it's an incredibly effective method to, controlling your population and frightening people. And it's been effective across the whole country. So a long, unhelpful answer, I'm afraid.
My question also related with his question, because sending rescued scholars and students to host country may depend on the immigration, education, welfare policy of the host country. So my question is, does IIE negotiate with the host country before sending the rescued scholar and student? Because you said to be you are working with usually tertiary education institution or university and education institution. How about the work with the government before sending students to host country?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we get quite often as well. There are, and in fact with the new alliance, there's a conversation about sort of legal pathways and how do students and scholars make their way to a particular country. IIE is not directly involved in negotiating with countries. However, we have here in the US tried to put forward a bill to Congress in changing the visa dynamics, and that there's actually a specific threatened scholar visa, and it would have encompassed students as well. Unfortunately, it did get traction, and then the political dynamics changed. But that's been an avenue we've been pursuing, is through the US channels, but internationally, unfortunately not. But there are lots of visas that fit perfectly for a visiting academic and a student. There are the student visas, there's the J1 exchange visitor visa, which still very much does hold true to scholars who are looking to leave for a year or two, and those on the J1 visa can come for up to 5 years if they're sponsored by their university. So that often does fit them very well, because then they can go back hopefully in 5 years, or they find their next steps after that. So we've relied very much on what are the current visa pathways right now. But it's a burning question for us, I'm sure for Nele as well.
Well, on the student side, I mean, talking about the United States, usually we bring students in as international students. If I can say we bring them in, it's really the university bringing them in. So all the work we do is, if we wouldn't have university partners, we just couldn't do what we do, right? So the center of our work is the university. So when we identify a scholarship recipient, we do have, so I mean, everyone, if you want a visa, you need a sponsor, right? So IIE, we cannot sponsor the visa of a student. I think for the scholars, it's different. So we cannot sponsor an F1 or a J1 visa for any of our students, meaning we rely on the university to do that. What they usually need is, of course, to know that the student has the financial means to support him or herself. Ideal scenario, the funding for the scholarship, or basically the student would get a tuition waiver from the university and an additional scholarship from IIE to cover living expenses. That is kind of our dream scenario, if I can call it like that. We get the question from students and universities all the time, can you help us in the visa process? And unfortunately the answer is we can't really, right? It very much, unfortunately, depends on the officer at the American Embassy that very specific day and time. What we do is we do provide a letter of support where we say, well, the student is participating in this program, and usually if we're talking about the United States, the officers a lot of times know IIE, so they know Fulbright, they know other programs, so it kind of does give a little bit of extra weight. But that might not be the case if we want to place the student in the UK or in Sweden. So still, we're going to provide those letters of support. We work with the universities to say, if you can also, other than the, let's say in the United States, what is it called for the F1, the I-20? Other than that, if you can also provide a letter of support, just like explaining a little bit, this is the program the student is going to participate in, just to give a little more of additional information. There almost can't be too much information, specifically for some students coming from, the countries on the list, if I can call it like that. So really, any additional information from the university and from IIE is helpful. But to be very honest, we don't have any special relationships in the embassies. There's only so much we can do. And we do rely heavily on the universities to provide the documentation that is really required.
Thank you.
With regards to universities that host, I just took a quick look at your program, and I'm wondering if the organization has relationships with developing countries, and maybe that goes to your brain-drain question, because it seems like the scholars are coming from third world countries, developing countries, going to the West. So, for example, if you're an African scholar and you're being threatened, one easy way would be to just move to another region in Africa that isn't necessarily being threatened. So I'm wondering if that type of model is being used, or why your organization, for example, is not necessarily looking at that pathway. Is it cheaper? Is it I don't know, is it culturally beneficial to move them from developing countries to developed countries?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we have placed scholars, so 43 countries around the world have hosted. And within Africa, I'm just looking quickly at the list here. So we've Cote d'Ivoire, we'll consider the whole continent of Africa, Egypt, just looking through quickly, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and that's it right now. But those are countries that have hosted. And the focus for those, and with any placement, we've asked the scholar first and foremost, where is it that your research or your teaching can be undertaken? Many of them have a preference for coming to one country or another, but often that's not possible for visa reasons or financial reasons as well. We try as much as possible to keep scholars as close as possible. Often that's politically not possible because they can't, the dynamics are not, don't allow for that. But there have been many cases. Unfortunately, it's a matter of resources in most cases. So, to host a scholar, we quite often have to waive the matching requirement from our fellowship of replacing scholars in some developing countries. Jordan was an example. Very few universities were actually were providing the matching funds, but we were able to work within that to make it work. But so the matching requirement's not really crucial, but once the scholars are there, they often found, we have a scholar from Nigeria who was focusing on endemic African diseases and very much wanted to stay within the region. She actually ended up going to South Africa, but the lab didn't have the required technical specifications for the very specific work she was doing. She was working on tuberculosis, and even though South Africa has strong research in that area, the university where she was situated didn't have the right, safety precautions within the lab. So she actually then went to Kenya for her second year fellowship. So that's one example where she stayed on the continent. I hate to say Africa is one, but so it is a model, but it's sort of a model that on a case-by-case basis isn't necessarily going to work. Yeah.
And I guess that's also true for the students. So for the Syrians, we do have partner universities in Lebanon, we have partner universities in Jordan and Iraq, but again, funding is a big question. And also for the students, specifically in Jordan, I think you've been very successful. We haven't been that successful. So what we want to see is universities kind of pitching in with tuition, or say, at least in Jordan, that Syrian students only have to pay what Jordanian students have to pay. But there was very little wiggle room, I would say, and it can be, and I think for us a lot of times it is just easier. Education here, with the exception of the UK, is expensive as it can get. So for that very reason, it would be great if we could place more students in kind of the region, neighboring countries. But then again, for us to navigate the system here or in European countries is in all honesty, a lot easier than navigating the system in, let's say, in Lebanon, in Jordan, where there's also kind of a political level, I guess, that comes into play that then gets sort of slightly challenging to navigate. And where then also there's a moment where we do traditionally get more tuition waivers in the United States and Western countries, as compared to countries in the region. And I will also have to say that in Iraq, our university is an American university, right? So it has been slightly challenging to place students in the region, and also a lot of the students, of course, aspire to go to Western countries.
So historically, DGA has been a host to many different scholars from around the world, but about 10 years ago, we were part of an initiative that would essentially help modernize Turkey's police force. Many, about 50 Turkish students got their PhDs, master's degrees with our program and criminal justice. And many of them went back and rose in the ranks. After the coup, unfortunately, many of them were jailed, many of their passports are revoked. We get emails all the time from these students asking for help. And while we've managed to have some success in bringing 1 or 2 scholars to our program, what's the best way to provide support or help to people who are stuck, but also have this really strong connection to our program?
So in regards to Turkey and the police force, I would say that it's very complicated. And you may know much more than I do, but just in the work that we've done in understanding the complexities of Turkey at the moment, those particular fields are extremely fraught. I'll leave it at that. So we've helped some scholars who are in that field, so to speak, but it's we've had a number of scholars who we've not been able to help because of the research we've looked into and just there's a background. I'll leave it at that. But if it were any other field, humanities, or and you find that students are have a connection to a university, I would say that we should just talk one-on-one about any particular student, or I'm saying student here, but scholar or student, because there are, if it may not be the right fit to bring them, say, to Rutgers, but we could find a partner in Europe if it's an easier trajectory to get from Turkey to Germany or wherever else. So we're always a resource. We can always think through ideas, and if we're not the direct financial or fellowship opportunity, we may know other partners that could help. So.
And I guess that's a really important point, and we just talked about that before actually kind of coming in. I think no one is going to solve this crisis, like no one university, no one IIE. There are different organizations that are working in the field, and we might not be the specialists on what exactly is happening in Germany, right? But there are organizations in Germany working on that topic, and there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from one another. Not everything always applies exactly in the educational context of each country, but I think what everyone is getting, and I'm only talking about the students, I think student kind of higher education emergencies was really very much at the margins of everything. But right now, if there's a silver lining to the Syria conflict, it really is that so many organizations all around the world do focus on developing sustainable programs that are not kind of this ad hoc reaction to, well, this is now happening, let's now react, on this, and then hopefully there's not going to be a crisis for the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years, and then we're going to recreate the wheel, and start from zero. So there are really a lot of organizations and great resources all around the world that we can all learn from, in the United States and abroad. And I think what we like to do at IIE in general is we say we are a convener, and that is very true. So we might not always be the organization that has the solution to a student's problem or a scholar's problem, but we do know so many players in the field, and we are very well connected here and abroad, that at least we can kind of make the connection that hopefully then helps a student or a scholar.
And we'd be very happy to talk to you about those things.
Yeah, and I think in general, one of the great benefits of those programs is everyone who's working on it is very passionate about it, right? So like everyone all of the employees at IIE, but also we call them sister organizations, everyone is really professionally and personally very involved, and I think like people do want to help. So in general, what we see is they really try everything to make something happen.
I'm curious about the system that you assess the risk, because those kind of conflict zones governments are really good at covering some of the risk conditions so that people cannot use that in international places. For instance, let's say somebody is already in the US and they have a regular visa, they are studying, some conflict is going on over there. No one is able to speak because of the pressure there, so he feels more obligated to speak out, to inform people about them, their sites, giving them information. After a couple of years, his visa expires, and then he has to go back. And what government does is if they have a file for them, they keep it in prosecution level, not in the court level, so that they cannot use it.
Right.
And as a person here, actually you are more in risk to file your risk than someone over there who can show the court file. And you have to go back. So what are the alternative ways that somebody can demonstrate their risk?
Do you mean in the application phase?
In the application.
Yeah, and I mean that's a calculated risk, obviously, for anyone who's out of their home country and is facing return, whether it be vocal. We've had many scholars who've had to make that decision. Should I bring attention to my case while I'm in a protected place, and unfortunately, we've had quite a number of scholars from many parts of the world who have faced consequences going back. So we are, and I should say that we're very, very cautious about ever talking about scholars publicly, because even 5 years down the line, they may very well find themselves in a difficult situation, even if they think at the time that they spoke that they were protected. So when we're vetting scholars for our program, it's very in-depth, and the Turkey context is very, very complex, and we're learning, as we go. We rely heavily first on the scholar's personal statement, so their account of what is, the threat that they're facing. We get letters of reference both in and outside of their home country when possible. We do a lot of desk research, so Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, we refer very heavily to those organizations. And then we look to experts in the field. We're never going to pretend to be the expert on Gulenist, movements or anything particular specific to a scholar. But there are experts that we can rely on, and the more we rely on experts, the more we find that many of the topics in Turkey are complex and multi-layered. So it's often a rabbit hole where this person falls in terms of, are they threatened? Are they creating some story to get the fellowship? But that's part of the leap of faith that we're taking, and really trying to investigate as much as possible the scholar's claims and having it corroborated by legitimate sources, effectively. So it's a lengthy process, and that's where I have to say that it's for a scholar to apply to our program in particular, it's a lot for them to take on, because there are so many questions and digging through data and information, and if something doesn't feel right, we have to look into it. So sometimes scholars are waiting 3 months or more to be vetted because there's so much complexity.
Yeah, and I guess for the students on our side, it is really different, to be honest. We talk about displaced students, so we don't necessarily, you come from Syria, we assume that you're displaced, at risk. When you talk about scholarships, so I think there always is the big criticism of being very elitist, meaning those who have the resources to pay for the living expenses, those who have the resources even to be able to fill out an application that is in English, right? All those people are anyway those who have a lot more resources in their home countries. And to a certain extent, that is true, but we also do face the reality that we have to place these students at universities. We cannot do it if they don't speak English. We cannot do it if they have a certain level of academic requirements. So in terms of kind of the risk, we don't assess a risk that a student is facing. We, in a way, assume you're from Syria, your education was disrupted. We do see that, from the application. We want to make sure that every student, regardless of their political background, right, that they go to a host country and that they're able to continue the education. So we, as a nonprofit organization and a nonpartisan education for the students, we do not base our selection on their political or their family's political conviction, to be very honest. There was some criticism about that, where again, specifically in the case of Syria, a lot say, well, those who have resources, they're usually closer to the government. And I can't necessarily say that that is true, to be very honest, when I look at the students who are here. In terms of how vocal the ones are who come here, again, as for the scholars, we have some who really want to make their voice heard, right? I mean, you see Sinan, he's out there, he's working with human rights organizations. We have, I guess, our poster child, she's called Sara Mustafa. She travels all over the world. She really wants to make sure that she's an advocate for students in emergencies and why education is important. But again, we do have a lot of students who say, you know, listen, I appreciate the opportunity we're having here, but I still have family in Syria. So I'm not going to go on the record and you know, kind of share my experience, or also share why I'm here. So I think, like, in terms of how we, if I can say, utilize students for advocacy purposes, that is always in the hands of the student themselves.
We've gone past the time, sorry.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.